Okay, so I'm seeing people filtering in just now. So again, we're just going to get started properly and allow any latecomers to catch up and see and get on with the discussion as we go. So again, welcome to everybody who is listening in at the moment. This is one of the events for LGBT History Month from the University of Glasgow. And the topic for our discussion this evening is HIV and AIDS. So just to say just a really quick thanks actually to Dr. Amanda Sykes for bringing together a lot of LGBT people across the university together to put together a really amazing program for this entire month. It's been jam-packed, which is absolutely excellent. I'd also like to thank Tash Quinn for advertising for this event. I have no idea where to start with that, so I really appreciate it. And also to thank Eleanor Capaldi, who will be joining and helping for the Q&A later on, who is one of the co-conveners for our staff LGBT network. So I'd just like to now introduce myself briefly. I'm Sean. I'm an epidemiologist at the university. I'm not an HIV epidemiologist, but I am a gay man who has had probably more HIV tests than hot dinners in my time. I think many people would be able to say the same. So tonight we have Patrick Harvie, MSP, the co-leader of the Scottish Green Party, and Alastair Hudson, who is the Chief Executive of HIV Scotland. Do you want to introduce yourselves, Patrick? Do you want to introduce yourself and let people know how you got involved in sexual health?
Well, thanks very much, Sean, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you for a while tonight. I mean, as we were getting ready in the virtual backstage, Sean was mentioning it's a sin, which has put a lot of the kind of historical context much more into people's immediate awareness. And that was set just a little bit before I came out. There was a scene in which the guys in the flat there were watching the iceberg advert about HIV/AIDS back in the 80s. I was still a closeted little thing at home watching that with my mum and dad on the telly when that came on, and it was something that very much was prominent in my worldview before I came out. And so when I went away to uni, I kind of got involved in the kind of sexual health stuff that what would now be called an LGBT plus group, but in those days was called a lesbian and gay society in the uni, kind of distributing condoms and sexual health information and so on. But it was still a time when the newspapers were full of wildly overt homophobic language and a level of discrimination and prejudice about HIV and AIDS that would be astonishing today. This was in Manchester, and God's copper James Anderton was still sending squads of police to raid gay venues. Police geared up in rubber gloves and kind of biohazard gear and stuff like this. So that was the level of threat that our whole community felt under. Quite a bit later, I came back to Scotland and started volunteering with the LGBT youth group in Glasgow, and that was still at a very, very amateur, unprofessional, unsupported level. And I became the first youth worker attached to that group, and I was based within an HIV agency. And so that was kind of continuation of that work. And when I came into Parliament, it became a natural thing to try and establish a cross-party group on sexual health. So those are some of the steps that I've taken along the way.
Thank you for that. Introduce yourself just now.
Hello, my name is Alastair Hudson. It used to be McDonald, and I had to change it to Hudson because of a well-known Scottish folk singer famous for singing "You Can't Shove Your Granny Off a Bus." So the name had to go, and so did I. I left Glasgow in 1988, around the time when It's a sin was kind of getting towards the end of what you see in the show. And I've just moved back. Well, I'm moving back to work as the interim CEO at HIV Scotland. So it's been quite an interesting 33 years in the wilderness, really, to be coming back home. And I had no intentions of working in sexual health. I left Glasgow to go to theatre school and worked in various things. But Jill, who's in the show, who plays her own mother, and It's a Sin, was in Les Mis in the West End around the same time that I was kicking about. And it's lovely to see her being celebrated for the incredible work that she's done. Because, I mean, not only was she a positive activist, but she was actually a very kind, generous, smart woman that basically did go to the beds of the dead and the dying when it was a horrific time. I mean, you know, but it's weird. It seems you compartmentalise it because I think it was so kind of intense. But like if anybody's ever been to watch a baby being born or been close to somebody when they die, it's such a miraculous experience, such a profound kind of big thing. You tend to be compartmentalising it in your memory so you can process it. I mean, it was a bizarre time. My journey into sexual health was kind of weird. I was involved in a training business and I was asked to go work to deliver some training for the International Planned Parenthood Federation. And I've only 2 HIV tests. I've only needed 2 because the second one was reactive. And that was in 2009. Seemed that a long time ago. And the world has changed radically since the time of It's a Sin. For me, it's a tablet a day, and there's no theatrical, dramatic side effects. My transition into it with incredible peer support and learning has been remarkable. So I'm really keen to kind of certainly bring the positive aspect of what we've managed to achieve to the story, because I think we really have changed the world. I mean, I was a slightly bewildered young gay man in Cathkin High School in 1982 when this thing was meandering across the Atlantic with a range of myths. It was kind of happening in Los Angeles. There was an airstrip. It was kind of somebody, and it was only bottoms that were getting it, and it was a terrible thing. And then we had Clause 28. So it was a perfect storm between the Falklands War, Clause 28, and this kind of myth thing that was snaking across the Atlantic, which just said to me, "Thou shalt not fuck or thou shalt die." So it was a very, very intense time. And I think, you know, what's happened since has been something that we really, really should celebrate, because the advances in treatment, prevention, care, and now prevention with PrEP have not only been game changers, but they've informed things like the Ebola vaccine process, and now the COVID processes were all built on the back of a lot of very angry, loud activists that certainly put lots of sticks in the ground that people could walk towards and across.
Thank you for that, and obviously thank you for your perspective and your experience on this. And that you mentioned Jill from It's a Sin. I mean, one of the first things that I wanted to talk about in this event is the kind of concept of allyship. One of the major themes, the theme of LGBT History Month in Scotland is kind of unsung heroes. So it was essentially to ask both of you, in terms of thinking along the lines of allyship, given how important that is to us, obviously, as LGBT people in general, but also in particular for people living with HIV. How do you have anybody who sticks out to you as someone who has gone above and beyond that the general public might not know about? In any order, you can freestyle this one. That's absolutely fine.
Go first. Go.
Well, I mean, I think there's probably an extraordinarily long list. You could be here all night if you were trying to cover everybody that you would want to mention. I mean, I suppose. From my experience, certainly as in my student days in Manchester, and then a little bit later in terms of youth work when I was back in Glasgow, there's a need to recognise that, you know, as things have got better, many more young people coming out have felt supported and been supported, and that's great. But there have always been those for whom coming out is a risk of homelessness. Is a risk of rejection from family, alienation, estrangement, and so on. And that is still the case. the kind of organizations that provide support for people facing those kind of circumstances, who have reached out and tried to understand issues around sexuality, issues around sexual health and HIV and AIDS, and recognizing that there's a direct connection between, those are not just equalities issues in isolation or a health issue in isolation. They connect to our social well-being, our economic well-being, our participation in society. So there are organizations that I would think about that have joined those dots, made those connections, and not always led by or involving LGBT plus people in them, but just recognizing that this is the job that I'm doing, and this is a new aspect of the need for the service that I'm providing. So yeah, I probably don't want to name individual kind of names, but there are organizations who've always been more willing than others to recognize that this is not an agenda that can just be left in a silo for the affected community to deal with, but they've recognized that it's part of their own responsibility as well. And that's been true of government, it's been true of trade unions, and it's been true of NGOs and community organizations. So yeah, I would say something about that, about those kind of services generally.
It's interesting, the services. I mean, it's great the services are here. I mean, I remember there was a gay centre at George's Cross when I was a kid, and we'd kind of run up the stairs quietly and have a hot chocolate and think we were being so rebellious. And going to gay pride marches. I mean, I think I was genderqueer before it was branded. I mean, they used to call me a sissy, and now I'm cis. I mean, there's progress. So for me, it's quite interesting how it's changed. And I think we're at a really exciting, dynamically exciting change where, I'm 53 years old. We went in marches where they were throwing oranges with razor blades. I've got a scar here because I copped an orange at one point. And they were throwing Heineken bottles at us, and the police were protecting us from them rather than the other way about. So it was quite a radical time of activism. And nowadays, I mean, all the reasons that I left Glasgow is this slightly bewildered, flamboyant young man that was kind of working his way through the nice and easy colour range by the time he was 14. I mean, my mother was banging the bathroom door going, "Come out, I know you're dyeing your hair. It's a good job your father's blind." I mean, because the colours that I'd be coming out with every week were kind of, let's just say, varied. But in terms of somebody, the one person, it can just be one person. And I really challenge anybody that's watching maybe to be that one person, because when I was at school, we were invisibilised. I mean, teachers weren't allowed to speak about same sex. So you're invisibilising somebody, a culture, because of their sexual identity or practice, or even trying to figure out their sexual identity or practice. But there was one man that stands out in my mind, and he was an Indian English teacher called Mr. Tripani. I think he was Punjabi. I mean, he was a bit of a character. He had a wooden leg. You couldn't write it. I mean, he had a wooden leg, English teacher from India, passionate about language, and he put words. What does the word taste like? He gave us frameworks about using language. And the fifth year school dance, I had a pal at school who went to the school dance in fifth year, dressed in a Scout's uniform, a pair of fishnet tights with high heels, a boy with a big Fergie bow in the back of it. He went as a Scout camp. And the next day, this English teacher clocked us and said, "Come with me. You two were outrageous last night." Outrageous, that means you're out of your rage. Come in with you. See these in his teacher's resource cupboard in English department. He said, "Look at these books." I said, "Look, Noel Coward, William Shakespeare, Tennessee Williams, Terence Rattigan." He went, "Look at these bookshelves. If it wasn't for people that were outrageous, these bookshelves would be a hell of a lot emptier." And it was just that one thing, somebody that would actually look at you and just witness you. It was that simple. So for me, I guess in some ways, my alliances, I've made a commitment to reaching out to work with the trans community. And I've worked quite a bit with Clinic Q in London because I wanted to kind of stretch myself. And I think my mate of mine, Juno Roche, has written quite a few books. And she said, it's not enough just to be an ally. You actually have to not just stand up and do the trendy things, hello everybody, rather than good evening, ladies and gentlemen, the basics. She said, it's like, where are your friendship markers? And what's interesting, there was all the reasons I left Glasgow in 1987 are the reasons I'm coming back, because my cousin's kids are now watching It's a Sin, And my cousins are kind of going, my God, I never knew it was that bad. And the Waynes are just kind of bewildered that they didn't have gay friends. What do you mean? It's like, it's just, it's ridiculous that they don't know somebody who's trans or somebody who's lesbian or gay or questioning. It's like, what? Really? And I think that's remarkable. It's like, I mean, and I'm really excited about the things that I see happening in my immediate world about integration and acceptance, and even just not the kind of flash kind of obvious markers, but just kindness. There was a real absence of kindness when It's a Sin was happening, partly because of fear and partly because it was easier to be unkind than to be kind about things that were different. And I do believe, actually I know that's changed. And I choose to believe people behave badly because they don't know better. And you do better, and you know better, you do better, kind of thing.
Thank you both for that. And actually, just picking up before moving on from that kind of allyship thing, Alastair, what you said, that it can just be that one person at that point in time that really is so impactful.
You just have to see you and witness something, witness your life. That's why we're here on this planet called Earth.
I just, I mean, I know people aren't here to listen to me, but I do have a small anecdote that I really, talking about that one person who I'm not in touch with anymore. I haven't been for years just because, well, we live half a continent away from each other now. But when I was at uni, I wasn't out at home, and I got a dreaded text, as you would, from a guy that you'd slept with who said, oh, you might need to get yourself along to the clinic. This is back in the days of MSN Messenger, and I so happened to be talking to a course mate at the time, and I mentioned this to her because I didn't know who else to talk to. Obviously, it wasn't out of home. So I think this is probably going way back to the mid-noughties, and that just being there at that right time calmed me down. When she took me to the Sandyford, she spoke to the reception staff for me because I was panicking and in a state. And she was there through all of that. Again, we're not in touch anymore, but that moment of allyship was super important to me because I still remember it so vividly to this day because that was the moment I needed someone and they were there for me. So just before moving on from the issue of allyship and It's a Sin that's on just now, again, if we're not going to spoil it for anybody, if you've not seen it, you absolutely must see it. One of the things that I just want to say, as I mentioned in our kind of pre-game conversation, Philip Normal, who I follow on Twitter, runs a store in London, has been selling T-shirts emblazoned with La on front of them, and each one is sending 20 quids to the Terence Higgins Trust, and they're up at about £200,000 just now, which is an excellent amount of money for HIV charity. I'm more than happy, Alastair, if you want to give out a pitch yourself before the end of the evening for HIV Scotland. But I just say that as people were saying there, things are positive and things are moving forward really well. People want to be supportive now in a way that they never did in the past. So to take that on then, so we've just from the 1980s and the kind of regressive attitudes that people had back then, I'm thinking we're moving to now. What do you feel like the current climate is with regards to the contrast from the 1980s? And actually, I'd say, in terms of thinking about particular events that have maybe changed things, relating this to Section 28.
Alastair, do you want to take this one first?
Clause 28, don't swear at me. What does that mean? It's such a ridiculous thing to even think about now. You're invisibilizing a whole swathe of society by a blanket structural impediment to people actually being able to speak. We joke about masks and stuff, and there's been all that drama, which is nonsense. It's nonsense. We're going to get into the pros and cons of that. But you're actually basically in schools, for example, there's an obvious vertical. Teachers were not allowed to support young people that were going through whatever they were going through. They had to just turn a blind eye, and it gave people license to behave in ways that were, as you look at it now, abhorrent and ridiculous. you know, it's like we kind of got, we all like to think we're liberal lefties, but at the end of the day, everybody's got their prejudices in the past. I mean, I would rather know where they lived and then have somebody that's honestly biased than somebody pretending to be appropriate, because I think it's actually more authentic, and then you can do something with it. I think the denial of your biases is the dangerous thing. But that whole thing is basically like book burning in Germany. And you just kind of go, you're actually taking something that's a real thing and putting it in a corner and then digging a hole and shoving it in and putting concrete on top of it and pretending it's not there. Dangerous thing to do. And because of that, you couldn't develop services or programs or structures to support people, many of whom were in trauma. You know, and the impact of that has been really profound, I think, certainly in the HIV space. Because a lot of people engaged in maybe positioning, maybe in sexual behaviours that weren't the natural or wouldn't have been the normal journey through their sexual identity and development. And things happen when that happens. When there's no flow, when things are dammed, things tend to overflow and burst their banks, quite often with unpleasant consequences. So, I mean, it was a hellish thing, and thank God we can maybe reflect on it and maybe learn from it. But, you know, that's that saying, you know, people who don't consider their history are doomed to repeat it. And it's not that far away. These prejudices can easily be reactivated unless we're mindful of them. I think it's a very, very important thing to keep our eyes on.
I think that last point is really important. I mean, for me, a lot of this is about thinking about how things change. How does society change? You know, why is it relatively safe and easy for me since 2003 to be a politician who's out? You know, I was still working the Gay Men's Project when I stood for election the first time, and I put that on all my election leaflets. So there was never any question about coming out after I got elected. But it was relatively safe and easy for me to do that, and it has been since, because people did it when it wasn't safe and easy. A few people did it when it wasn't safe and easy. And that's like, you know, the way that HIV activism led to a professional health response. That activism happened when it wasn't safe and easy, because the communities that were directly affected said, nobody else is doing this for us, so we have to do this. And, you know, people would go to cruising grounds, parks and cottages and stuff, as well as to the scene venues, because that's where they knew the people were that they had, the men were that they had to reach with a life-saving message and a life-saving intervention. And perhaps it was done a little bit kind of, you know, in a way that a kind of professional, ethical organization might not totally approve of. You know, I've heard of people describing the earliest strategies by the phrase "fuck one, teach one." You know, you wouldn't have a professional public health organization nowadays doing something like that, but nothing was happening. And so people did stuff that wasn't safe and easy and wasn't clean and simple, stuff that was, you know, probably a bit dangerous, probably a bit risky, you know, but it only gets better because people do take those first steps. And the same with politics as well. You know, we've had incredible political progress, at least in this country, but that's never guaranteed. And it only continues to get better if people keep on doing the stuff that isn't necessarily safe and easy to try and make sure that the next generation get that further benefit. I was talking about this the other day with folk about Section 2A, and you know, if you think about a country like Russia, 25 odd years ago, you got decriminalization. 10 years later, you got an equal age of consent. Since then, there's been this incredible reversion, and homophobia and prejudice are being deliberately weaponized, very successfully weaponized by an authoritarian regime in a very populist and divisive way. So that progress we've made can go into reverse if we don't keep on doing the things that maybe feel a bit edgy and aren't always safe and easy. And at the moment, you know, inevitably, I think we're all very conscious of the fact that the kind of rhetoric that was being targeted at, particularly at gay men and about HIV back in the 80s and 90s, is now all of that language is being retooled and redirected at trans people. with kind of messages that say they're predatory and they're dangerous, or they're sick and they're broken and they should be pitied, or that people don't know their own mind, they're being manipulated. All of this, the same rhetoric of prejudice and hostility and toxicity is being redirected and in exactly the same way. So we need to keep on recognizing, who have the opponents of equality and human rights got in their sights, and stand up for one another.
So just on that about doing the hard thing when it's not necessarily not necessarily fashionable to do things that are difficult. I'm thinking a couple of years ago, I can't remember exactly when it was, but people like Gareth Thomas, the Welsh international rugby player, coming out as HIV positive. Do you think that having high-profile people like that is helping change the attitudes right now in terms of specifically relating to HIV, but obviously in terms of toxicity to trans people in public life at the moment it's horrific, but sorry, it's just a double-barreled question, I guess. Do you think that the toxicity, so again, while people doing the hard thing, like I said, just use an example of an international rugby player coming out, do you think while we're moving forward in this type of way, we're actually reducing access to services? So for example, trans people who have HIV risks, but don't necessarily feel safe coming out, being necessarily able to access services, is that a potential problem that we're maybe overlooking, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of lazy sense of thinking that just so long as a service exists, that's good enough. For people to be able to access that service, you need to address the barriers that have to do with fear, a perception of prejudice. That will have affected. I remember when I was in the HIV sector. Remember in particular one time, this guy came in. He must have been in his mid, maybe late 70s. And he was coming out for the first time, coming to make contact and speak to someone for the first time, because his mother, at the age of 100 or something, had just died. And he hadn't felt able to access any kind of service up until that point. Inevitably, that will have increased the risks that he may have run prior to that. And similarly, when there are other barriers to services, that means that people won't get the benefit of being able to access that. And Alastair, HIV Scotland will be painfully aware of all the different kinds of barriers to people actually accessing the services. It's not enough that they're there. We need to look at what's preventing people from accessing them.
I think the interesting thing about that, and it's quite complex, it's the layers of it that's interesting. I mean, a bog standard service, which can be really high quality within the NHS, really solid medical competencies. It's bright and shiny, it's nice and white, it's got lovely lighting, nice chairs, free Wi-Fi, and a cup of tea. And if you're lucky, you might even get a chocolate biscuit. But if you are a homeless person and you're maybe just a wee bit too smelly, or you're somebody who is in chaotic drug use, or you're somebody that's got no recourse to public funds,
absolutely,
or who's just beginning their transition. And I'm really clear, I want to be very careful about speaking to trans persons unless there are trans people here, because there are enough people in speed dial that you can actually harvest for that. And I think 2 gay men, 3 gay men being here, if you identify as gay, Sean, I don't even know. But just kind of, just that for me is really critical, because unless we actually engage people in the conversation, it's like, I'm really clear. It's like, my cousins don't get to speak for my sexual identity in practice because I don't ask them about theirs. But I think the thing about where this thing fits in is that we're really on the cusp of a dynamic time where young people are really starting to kick this conversation about. So it's not a case of penis boy, vagina girl, and having men in grey suits speaking about vaginal health or abortion rights. And these narratives that we now have as policy organisation, HIV Scotland, was born out of the Scottish AIDS Monitor. That came from a lot of activists that were watching our gay brethren and, you know, sisters that were along with it, that were basically throwing their dead partner's ashes over the gates of the White House to get Ronald Reagan's attention. It didn't work. At least in this country, much as the Thatcher government was many things that we can rip to bits. The Don't Die of Ignorance campaign was kind of brutal by advertising standards today, shock and burn, but it did achieve really dramatic public health outcomes. It slowed down the projected incidence of what was going to be everybody dying and it was all going to be black and the world was going to end, to becoming something that developed into prevention programs, condom advocacy, and now from that we have PrEP. So I think, you know, what's happened is, you know, I now work in what is now a kind of industrialized policy environment, but it was born out of loudmouth people shouting loud. You know, people get their human rights, whatever the hell that means. It's such a kind of privileged thing to say, I want my human rights. And it's like, you know, this entitled thing that we assume that we are entitled to. You know, there are people that are not able to access vaccines for COVID, that are not able to access clean drinking water. I mean, my mother used to say, we wash our shit away every day with drinking water. We're doing very well. We should be grateful. I mean, grateful isn't enough because, you know, this is the world that we live in. But I think services and systems and structures have to change to be much more relevant to a broader gender, sexual identity. A question was asked there about, do I believe that Clause 28 impacted on access to services? Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, all through my high school life, I was told I was less than. I mean, let's face it, I had a lot of armography going on. I mean, Janelle Curry, who was involved in your network, she sat next to me in primary school, primary one, 4 years old. I mean, I was kind of flaming when I was a wee boy. My cousins talk about me dancing to Lulu, boom, bang, a band, playing the records as a wee boy. I mean, that's who I was. And I'm just lucky that I'm able to become who I am because I created safe spaces. I think it's about making safe spaces within health settings, within policy organisations, within universities. You know, and if women deem that they need a safe space for women's discussions, then so be it. Same with the trans conversation. I mean, do you know who's been my great teacher? She said she chose to get off the train at trans. She didn't go to the trans women's station. And I said, what does that mean? And she went, thank God you're asking. If you ask with an open heart and a willingness to listen, generally communities will share with you. If you go in with a head down, deciding that the outcome's going to be, you're generally doomed.
Thank you both on that. I'm just going to move us along a little bit now to a topic that we have touched on earlier, but possibly one of the most significant advances since the start of the pandemic, probably even more so or secondary only to the treatments in the mid-90s that now let us stop people moving from having HIV into AIDS, is PrEP. So for those who are the uninitiated here, that stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. Does anybody want to start with PrEP, maybe explaining a little bit about it and then discussing the kind of current impact on it, because it's essentially one of our main tools now of stopping future HIV transmissions.
First on that, Patrick. I mean, I'm happy to jump in, but if you want
to. I was going to suggest you were probably HIV Scotland, probably best placed to talk about that if you want to kick off.
I can tell you what I know. I mean, I'm not a medic. First of all, he says employing caveat. I think the dynamic things, been really dynamic things that have happened in the last 3 years. And just to summarise them, I mean, treatment as prevention. It's kind of a bit of a what? Treatment as prevention? What does that mean? You know, there's the whole prevention narrative in the HIV space has changed in that for somebody who's living with diagnosed HIV, or even someone who's diagnosed tomorrow, you wouldn't want to go shopping for it. But if you are diagnosed tomorrow, you will leave the clinical setting with treatment which you will use to control your HIV or stop your HIV virus replicating. So there'll be less viral load in your body and you can achieve what we would call an undetectable viral load. It means there's not enough copies of the virus in your blood or in your fluids for you to transmit HIV. So basically, you kind of reduce the potential for infection and as such, homeward transmission. So as a positive person, I take a tablet a day to support my onward transmission risk using treatments prevention. If you're in a group that's maybe vulnerable to acquiring HIV more than other groups, for example, we know there's more HIV in some MSM groups. Trans people sometimes negotiating sexual activity, never mind prevention, can be a conversation that can be challenging. If a woman who has is psychologically or financially dependent on her partner, sometimes consent can be an issue and prevention can be an issue. Culturally, some people, I don't like using condoms because it makes me less of a man. Bullshit. It doesn't. Just to be clear, it does not, in fact. But if you've got those narratives going on, we've now got a prevention tool called pre-exposure prophylaxis. Again, it's one of the tablets that are sometimes used in the HIV treatment regime, but it's a tablet at the moment, and there's going to be an injectable version of it coming online in time that you would take to basically prevent your body from, if you're exposed to HIV, basically it means that your cells don't become HIV infected. So in some ways it acts like a prevention tool to prevent you acquiring HIV. And it's something that somebody maybe uses like maybe in a basket of prevention tools. So if you're a young woman who's maybe having multiple sexual partners, and good luck to you if you are, understanding your contraception needs and your maybe your STI and bloodborne virus risk, you'll be taking a basket of prevention options. And I mean, at 53, I need less sex than I did at 22, thank God. But I think it's really important to understand that prevention now is a basket option. So if you're a young trans woman, you know, or you're transitioning and you're engaging in maybe some hormone management and you're looking at what your sexual practice is, it's about understanding your sexual literacy. What is my sexual identity? What's my sexual practice? And what's my sexual risk? And from that, you can construct a conversation about your prevention needs. And there are various tools that you can bring into that conversation and employ them as and when you need to. But your arc of a sexual journey changes. It does, you know, some bits get better as you get older and some bits get worse. And your prevention needs change proportionately. If you're a childbearing age and you are maybe vulnerable to unplanned pregnancy, understanding contraception is useful. If you are in a group that maybe has greater HIV numbers, or you perceive that you might be deemed somebody who could be at risk of enhanced STI or bloodborne virus risk, get to know what your prevention options are. And there are various ways that we can support you to do that.
I think seeing it in the historical sort of sweep of the decades that we've come through as well, there's something about how does society perceive a particular disease? What does a particular disease or medical condition mean socially? We've seen this in the last year with COVID, for example. Countries where, like take the US, you had for most of the last year a president openly describing COVID as Chinese flu, and trying to basically say this disease is like flu, that it's not very important, not very serious, you know, just go over it or whatever. And you see that on some of the kind of more libertarian politicians in this country as well. They're comparing it to flu. If you perceive COVID as being a bit like flu, that's going to change your attitude and your responses to it. And of course, it's not like flu. With HIV, if your perception of it, if your society's perception of it is still couched in those beautiful husky tones of John Hurt voicing over that iceberg advert, if you still perceive it as a death sentence, if you still perceive it in those ways, then your reaction to it and your engagement with it and even your willingness to think about it is going to be very, very different. HIV is not the disease that we perceived it to, or that many people perceived it to be at that point, even though a lot of the media, for example, will still present it in that way. They'll still present it as almost as a moral judgment. And there are some people, you know, you saw some of those scenes in XSN as well, where people saying HIV is not a disease, it's a judgment from God. If that's your perception of it, if that's what it socially means to you, it's going to change your attitude. And so you get some of the same right-wing press that took that moral judgment position back in the 80s and 90s, who respond to something like PrEP as though that itself is a moral outrage. It's giving license for depraved behavior. You know, there's a kind of moralism, a kind of moralistic sort of simplistic moralism and a sort of judgmentalism that comes with that. Actually, what we're talking about now is a chronic manageable condition. There are many, many chronic manageable conditions. It is still an infectious one, but we can control how infectious it is. And if you're able to take the drugs that you know, that either reduce your own viral load to levels at which it's not transmissible, or if, as Alastair was saying, you have, you know, reasons to think that PrEP is a good option for you, and you're able to access that. Again, we can massively reduce its transmissibility to negligible levels, and we can massively increase how easy it is to manage in terms of the impact it has on somebody's health. So, you know, rationally speaking, we are way, way, way beyond the idea that in at least in a country with a well-developed socialized healthcare system, this is no longer going to destroy huge numbers of lives. It's a chronic manageable condition, but it is well manageable. And yet we still have underneath that attitudes that try to interpret what HIV is, that are still rooted in those ignorant days from the 80s and 90s, where it was either a death sentence, or it was a judgment from God, or it was a kind of moralistic issue. So yeah, the attitudes and the understanding of what this disease is need to catch up with reality.
Interesting that. The bottom line is, though, HIV in this country, we live in a country where HIV is a sexually transmitted disease, fact. And that means most people acquire HIV, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, through anal or vaginal sex. And that can be a constructed vagina or a cis vagina, or, you know, a brown one or a Muslim one or a Christian one or an old one or a young one. And so that is one of the taboos, because it's a sexually transmitted infection. And it's still a big taboo that people are scared to go near. However, what I'm really keen to do is to get people to start speaking about not so much risk. And there was a lot of things that came out. Don't die of ignorance, the minor descending chords, and the icebergs falling, all that gloom and doom stuff, which is what it is. Safe sex, safer sex. There is nothing safe about sex. You can have barrier protection and you can consider what you're doing in terms of protection. But if you're going to have sex with somebody and show up, it's the most vulnerable thing you can do in the human experience, you know, because it's actually a place that you're really vulnerable emotionally and physically and spiritually, if that's where you go with it. But understanding prevention and understanding risk, so you are a sexually literate person that understands everything from consent to what your prevention choices should be. And if something happens where you have a risk-taking episode, as they say in the trade, that you understand that you might need to consider emergency contraception, an abortion choice, PrEP, PEP, or maybe if you acquire HIV and you're diagnosed, what your treatment options are going to be. Not being scared of, oh my God, this is the death sentence, you know, you're going to die. Because I've got a nephew who's pushing 10, and I've been really nice to him because he's going to be putting me in a nursing home. So, so I've got an agenda here to be nice to this 9-year-old wee boy. So I think this whole thing, there's an overhang from the It's a Sin world. But what It's a Sin has done is it's actually started conversations about, oh my God, a couple of my cousins have called me going, we never knew it was that bad. If we'd known, we'd have done things differently. And I said, no, you wouldn't, because emotionally you weren't able to. I mean, you weren't able to.
No, absolutely. And you use the phrase sexual literacy, I think, and it's interesting that you get a lot of the same issues around things like young pregnancy and unintended pregnancy, and the the kind of newspapers, the kind of reactionary voices that are most kind of furious about those statistics when they're bad are also the ones who are most hostile to sex education. Even though objectively everybody who even takes 5 minutes to look at the evidence can see, getting good quality, genuinely holistic, thoughtful sex education and relationships education is the most effective thing that you can do to prevent people from encountering those risks that they wouldn't want to run.
For me, I think that's a really interesting angle, because for me, I think sexual health and sexual and relationships education is a social justice issue rather than a rights one, because we actually know what best practice is. We know what the information is technically and, and scientifically and, educationally. And if we are actively withholding that from our young people or from any population group, it's an issue of social justice for me. And I think I'm more interested in having a conversation about it in a social justice space than I am about an educational one. Because we know the truth. By not telling the truth, we're actually withholding it.
So it's just something that both of you've kind of touched on about kind of obviously sexual literacy. But one of the things that I've been trying to track down the tweet today, but I can't find it to actually quote it verbatim. But it was actually from one of the actors from It's a Sin, Nathaniel Hall, who lives with HIV himself, who tweeted essentially about one time discussing the issue of PrEP and one of the tools available.
He lives with HIV. HIV lives with me. I pay the mortgage.
I mean, I'm sure it's happy for the freebie, but it's it was interesting seeing this particular tweet, because he said that a prospective partner of his, again I can't remember the quote exactly, but mentioned and discussed PrEP with him, and when they had a discussion about it, said that, well, at the end of the day, I have to be responsible for my own sexual health. I can't be responsible for you taking your medication to reduce transmission. It's effectively along those lines. And when I read that, it really kind of made me think about that issue of contraception in women in terms of pregnancy avoidance, which is that men tend to leave it up to women to worry about taking the pill or whatnot, or having the implants or things like that, taking all the onus away from it. And it was interesting to see that actually someone being aware of their own ability to control it, I found very interesting perspective there. I do have a quick question, just so that we can get a little bit more in. By the way, questions from the audience, Eleanor is collating them for me, and they'll be asked just at the end when we've covered all of the core key topics, and we'll go back into your specific questions just at that point. But before we move on from PrEP, I really have my basic question is, and yeah, again, you both touched on it there, but it's access to PrEP. In terms of, so I lived in England when I was doing my postgraduate studies. I moved up to Scotland. I don't know if you can tell from the accent, I'm from here originally, but I moved down to Liverpool, moved back up here, and access to PrEP is very, very different based on your geography. And I have to say, do you think access is going to be one of these bottleneck issues that we're going to find by trying to get people onto this very amazing kind of medication? But do you think it's the bottleneck that we're going to face at the moment?
There's no reason for it structurally to be a bottleneck. I mean, Scotland was the first country to actually have PrEP. So, I mean, Scotland's got an amazing rights framework. It's constitutional. I mean, the way that we actually tackle rights is actually really solid. What's interesting for me, though, is how people's awareness of access rights are really changing. And I think unless you've actually got access, rights, and awareness, it's pointless of in the services. People that don't perceive themselves as being vulnerable to risk, understanding what practice is risky, people that were in It's a Sin, it was a world people didn't even know how it was transmitted. I mean, what I'm really keen to do with young people are the programs that I'm keen to put my shoulders behind, are getting people to understand the bigger picture. Who am I? Well, I mean, I think it's how we transact power, and the language that we have around is really dangerous. HIV is transmitted or acquired. Equal platform, because if it's like that, You know, it's not, you know, if, for example, that girl fell pregnant, you know, and he knocked it into her. You know, it's like that kind of like, you go, wait a minute, that's actually not in balance. It's you know, so I think the way that we use language, you know, HIV isn't passed on or caught or given. You know, you don't go in the subway and go, I'm going to give you my flu. It's just not how it works. I mean, you know, if people are actively infecting somebody else with a virus, that's a psychotic behavior. You know, it's like you're no well, and there's something else going on that's maybe driving that. So I just think it's the language of power, how we communicate these things. Maybe we need to consider the lexicon of it all at this time in light of a gender lens and rights lens and social justice lens. I think it's time to look at it that way.
I think it also connects back to something, Alastair, that you said earlier about, you know, talking about human rights and you know, saying I've got a right to access, you know, certain services or whatever. It can sometimes be a bit of a privileged thing. If people don't know, first of all, that the option exists, if people, you know, their GP or whoever it is that they you know access for healthcare doesn't either know their life circumstances or doesn't feel inclined to raise it, or they don't feel safe to raise it, then you know or if they don't know that there are specialist services, whether it's a sexual health clinic or a support group or whatever, if they don't have access to those things, then you don't even get to the point of making a decision. You can only get to the point of making a decision if those things are available to you. So rather than worrying about a kind of bottleneck, I think there's more a question about, you know, an ongoing need for every generation coming through to make sure that that the access to those services and the access to those rights is not a privileged thing. It's something that feels natural to everybody, and that that people feel able to talk about and ask questions about.
The frameworks we've got though for access are brilliant. But if you don't know what access means, or your a right, or your ability to access stuff, or your need to access stuff, it's meaningless.
Yeah.
These policies that sit in the back of the internet are useless. Just collecting.
So, you know, the comparison with what I was talking about when I went to uni, you know, the fact that everybody was just throwing around condoms all over the place. Every student group was, you know, free condoms with everything. Free condoms. It's a physical way of putting the issue into people's hands. And that was a really powerful thing. Even if most of them never even got used, it was a really powerful way to put the issue, to make the issue real and tangible. And we kind of don't have that in relation to something like PrEP. It feels like an abstract thing until, you know, you get over that hurdle, you know.
I think if that's the thing, I mean, I'm really keen that it's framed within a broader prevention narrative, because if it's not a special thing, it's a special thing. I think it's much more holistically, so that, you know, if there, you know, so that prevention advocacy becomes broader and it can be used more meaningfully, rather than it being, oh, you need PrEP, and it becomes one of those things that those people do. Oh, right. Those need that, or those trans people need that. And I think that's actually more harmful, because it makes it, if it's exclusive, it can't be inclusive. You know, so it's like, for me, I'm going, I think that's the danger. And I think the numbers were PrEP for the first round of it, because it's quite a young prevention tool. I mean, people used to have to wear their sister's wedding rings to go and get the contraceptive pill in the 60s. I remember my mother telling me that she did borrow her sister-in-law's wedding ring to go and get the pill. I mean, it was like, she was being so rebellious. Thankfully, it's not like that. I think it needs to be seen more broadly in the context of the basket of prevention tools available.
I think that is an absolutely excellent point about if, again, Patrick's in there, but if you don't know it's there, you know, you can't get it. And also Alastair saying that, you know, it's just for these groups. I do actually, and I would say personally, as someone who has tried to access it, I do find that it does seem to look a bit exclusive like that. And I do think that there might be scope in future, I think, to definitely try and make this as an inclusive thing. I agree that that's definitely the way forward. Just before the last topic I want to go on to is U=U and that campaign. But just before doing that, on the issue of access to things, for anybody that's interested, if you go on to www.hivtest.scot, you can get a free at-home HIV test sent to your house.
No, you can't. That programme has been suspended for the moment.
Has it? Okay, that's unfortunate, because that is an excellent programme.
6,500 of them sent out during It's a Sin.
Oh.
The spike was, so we're actually in conversations about getting funding to reactivate it. But it's been a very interesting process. 6,500 tests went out between February the 12th and last Friday.
That, I mean, that in itself is absolutely fantastic. Okay, well, go to that website when they've got tests back available. But obviously, just in terms of access,
within the NHS mechanism.
But that's fantastic. So that's 6,500 people who will now know what their status is, and obviously, early treatment is better than late treatment for any condition, including HIV. So that's actually really overwhelming. It's 6,500, and that's in Scotland alone, yeah.
Yes.
I dread to think what it's been like if you look at the UK-wide figures for that. I think that's excellent. Okay, so just to move to U=U, and just for the audience who might not be familiar with this, U=U is undetectable is equal to untransmissible. It's been a campaign slogan for a wee while now. I've definitely seen it at a pre-COVID times Pride before. And essentially, someone who's on effective HIV medication is not able to transmit HIV to their partner, even in situations of otherwise unprotected sex. And I guess just to kind of start on this, how has the kind of U=U campaign changed the life for people who HIV lives with?
I've seen people be really empowered by it. I mean, you know, people who have always thought they were a vector of infection. They were the thing that was carrying the thing that was the thing that was going to do the thing. Suddenly it was like, I'm harmless. Now, that's got biomedical implications. What it does for your psychology is phenomenal. I mean, I was working in Ireland because I run the People Living with HIV stigma survey in the UK. And it was a guy, and I said, so are you working? He said, no, I couldn't go back to work. See, I was a chef, and it's the knives. I mean, if I cut myself, you know, the blood, I'd never forgive myself. And I said, well, what do you think your blood's going to be doing? You know, I mean, he said, well, I mean, if I infect somebody, I said, well, you're actually undetectable, untransmittable, and infectious. I mean, I could do the most despicable things to any orifice I've got, as far as I'm aware, and not transmit HIV, not that I'm offering, to be clear. But I think it's quite remarkable that people now can medically deem themselves as not being somebody who is a vector of something that's been something they might have internalized in a way that's been harmful, excluding themselves from things because they think they are something that they're not. So it's been very empowering. I mean, you know, same thing, being young and gay, people just think that, you know, my God, I'm going to be thrown out of my house and my family are never going to speak to me again, and I'm going to be banished or battered, or, you know, I mean, I think my dad's version of my gayness was I was going to wind up sitting in front of a gas oven or throw myself out a window and having a miserable life. I have a great life. You know, it's like, I mean, you know, that the version of my dad's projections hasn't been my reality. It's been a hell of a roller coaster ride, and I've loved it. You know, in the same way that guy in It's a Sin said, you know, there's good bits and bad bits, but there's bits that are remarkable and wonderful. And having peer mentorship early on that enabled me to understand the technical bits of living with HIV meant that I managed to avoid some of that. So that's why I'm really passionate about the job I do, so that people that are maybe in the fear place might not have to have that fear place as brutally as other people that I've seen have. That's why I go to work in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point about people feeling empowered is really important, and in a way, it's a kind of it's an extension of what most people, I hope, have come to expect from the medical community, is the slow, gradual death of the doctor knows best mentality, and you know, the medical profession, like any you know, highly educated profession, can have quite a lot of inertia and be slow to change culturally sometimes. But for the most part, we've moved much more closely toward a position where people expect to be involved in their medical care and informed about it, and given the truth, rather than having a kind of doctor knows best sort of paternalism. And if you think back to the time before antiretrovirals, a lot of people, including HIV activists, would have been quite cautious about the ethics of encouraging people to get a test if they don't know what you can do with that information.
It was hellish.
Yeah.
I mean,
and the greater availability of effective antiretrovirals increases the argument in favor of actually, maybe we should actively encourage people to get a test, because that gives them information that they can do something with, that they can take control. And now, having that broader range of tools in the box, it's all about giving people the information as well as the practical choices that can take control, and managing a virus like HIV in an active, ongoing way, in a conscious way, that gives people ongoing confidence for the rest of their lives. That not just that they can live their own lives safely and healthily, but that they don't feel that they're a risk to other people. That they have the information to know that that it's not the disease it once was. It's not the danger that it once was. It's about giving people information and choices that let them have power and control over their own lives. And that's something that most people, I think, increasingly, I hope, have an expectation of.
The choices thing, I think, is the thing that's critical, because being empowered. I mean, like, I speak to young people when I was working at Brook. I used to speak about when you start assuming responsibility for your dental health, as in you go to the school dentist without your mum, you're still shitting yourself, but you front it and you go in, 14, 15, that might be the time to start contemplating your sexual health and well-being choices and prevention. So maybe going for a test, or maybe kind of engaging with, even if you're not even sexually active, if you've not debuted or started your sexual journey, getting yourself aware, because it's power. And the more power you've got to transact your life, the easier quite often your life can be. So for me, I think it's a bit the frame. I just think we've been dealing with these old-fashioned models of language. It's a bit, the more power you've got, the easier it is. Because I think our sexuality, it's almost like the denominator how we communicate. It's like this kind of silent currency. It's like, if you're going to go to France, learn how to speak French, at least a few words, you'll have a better time. Same thing with your sexuality. Depends
which few words you choose.
True.
That's one of the best analogies I've ever heard on that one, actually, Alastair. I think I'll have to remember that one.
You're going to steal comedy, steal from good people. I did.
Okay, so just to wrap up then with the main discussion, and then go on to a couple of question and answers then, if that's all right with everyone. So we've been at this about an hour now. Just to kind of wrap up, and just before, obviously, if anybody else kind of drops out now, just to let you know that we do have a lot more going on at the university in terms of LGBT History Month. Again, we've all been at home for this entire time and have had plenty of time to think up things we can do. So if you check on the events page at the University of Glasgow, keep checking out for that, and we'll be uploading more. I think there might be a few things kind of running into next month. I'm sure there's an LGBT arts event going on sometime later this week. I'm not sure the exact dates and times of that, but it sounds like a really promising event. So with that, to move on, we have 4 questions so far. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in. Eleanor is looping me into it. So 2 of these are quite linked. Actually, 3 of these are quite linked, so I'm going to say them all out just now, and then go on to the next one. So how do you feel schools and government can improve health literacy for younger and current generations? I do feel this does feel linked. And someone else said it seems that HIV and AIDS has dropped off the wider sexual health conversation in general, because it's now seen as manageable. Is that worrying? And do you think there's a need for another high profile campaign about HIV and AIDS? And obviously I think kind of linking all of this into opinions about HIV and AIDS and education. So what do you both think about that?
Well, I think maybe after the year that we've all just come through, the last thing a lot of people want is a high-profile campaign about a health condition. My feeling also is that the most effective way to make sure that this is still on people's radar is to build it into other conversations rather than just having a single bespoke campaign. You know, they wouldn't repeat the kind of iceberg stuff that I was talking about earlier, but and nor should they. But trying to find a way to build it into other conversations about all sorts of aspects of life is perhaps more important or maybe more effective. And in relation to education, I think there's obviously people, the kind of people who've chosen to be part of an audience in an event like this will know about things like the Thai campaign and the commitments that have been made, and also the difficulty that's been had in trying to follow through on those commitments to actually implement what the promises of the Thai campaign have been, or the promises given to it. But if we can see in the next session of the Scottish Parliament real progress on that, it genuinely needs to be inclusive. It needs to not become siloed off as, here's education for LGBT plus people. Here's education that, you know, we'll give you your inclusive education over there in that room on this one day a week or whatever. It genuinely needs to be inclusive and holistic and for everybody and about everybody. So there is real, I think, exciting opportunity if we can follow through on that campaign and the promises that have been made and not yet fulfilled. That really could be quite transformational if we set about it in a way that really means what's been said.
Around the campaign, I agree. I think it's got to be seen in the context of a broader, holistic sexual health offer. To be honest with you, we are in the winter of the HIV/AIDS response. You know, we've been really successful. There were these UN targets, 1990, and the idea was 90% of people living with undiagnosed HIV should get into treatment. 90% of those people should, should be diagnosed. 90% have gone into treatment, and then 90% of them should achieve an undetectable viral load. In Scotland's numbers are sitting at 92, 98, 94%. So we're looking at small numbers that are still out there that have not been diagnosed. Maybe they don't deem themselves as being vulnerable, or those people that might engage with services. And it's about taking some of those judgments away. I mean, it was like something that happened to, gay people, whatever the hell that means, a ridiculous expression, or even worse, Black Africans, which is even more ridiculous. I just kind of goes like, people think it's certain people that have that thing. And I think it's the issue that is maybe being missed. Certainly in education, we just need to give teachers really good resources to teach really good, high quality information to people that it's perceived as being a complex subject. So let's resource teachers and educators in educational settings with resources that can support them to do it well. And that's the advocacy policy bit that I'll be battering Patrick Harvie, MSP, and his colleagues to engage in the conversation. Because I think that's the game changer, but getting representation from somebody who's beginning their transition journey, a gay woman who's 50, somebody who's maybe engaged in an emergency contraception solution, and a young gay man that's flaming, and everything in the middle, so there's a range. The representation, so or else it's not credible.
I think just the last question that we have from the audience here actually just really, I think, ties into what you're saying, Alastair, there, is how do we counteract stigma today in the here and now? Obviously, we've had quite a bit of a chat about stigma through the years earlier on, but how do we deal with it at this moment in time?
Representation, every time. Representation. People haven't seen it, don't know it. Until you've seen it, you don't understand it. I mean, it's like, oh, I've never met somebody from there. Oh, well, maybe you should. Might be good for you. Every time, representation.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something about it's a sin, actually, and Russell T Davies's other work, whether it's Doctor Who kissing a man, whether it's I mean, that's when a man was playing Doctor Who, whether it's stuff like the back in the 80s and 90s, you would have seen soap operas and so on, the first same-sex kiss, and you had this extraordinary storm of outrage in the newspapers afterwards, and sometimes in Parliament afterwards as well. But yeah, representing, just making this part of life. You know, these kind of high-profile TV spots, loath though I am as a politician to admit it, more people watch them than watch our speeches in Parliament. Sure. Yeah, I do have to confess this. So that kind of high-profile representation has huge power still.
Yeah. And then the message attached to it.
I have to say, I mean, obviously, I just on this as kind of personal input from me there, I absolutely agree with that. Obviously, growing up, there were very, very few queer people on television. Now, I mean, I'm a big Trek nerd, and now watching Star Trek Discovery, it seems wall to wall queer, and it's fantastic. It's great. But I compare that to, you know, the equivalent series in my younger days. I didn't quite get that representation that I could see. So it makes a massive difference. Okay, that's all of the questions we have from the audience. And I'd just like to say again, thank you to both our speakers, to Patrick, to Alastair. Thank you for a really engaging discussion this last hour and a bit. Thank you to Eleanor for helping me out with the online admin, because I'm not very good at it. I wouldn't be able to do that myself. Thank you. And thank you for those who've stuck with us this last hour and a bit. I really appreciate it, and I hope it's been an informative event. Thank you all.
Well, thanks again for the invitation. Nice to speak to you all.
Bye.